Hi everyone, Mike here from Bikes by Mike with another cycling related video. Today is bike maintenance day. I'm going to show you how to cut a carbon steer tube to size and install a headset compression expansion plug properly. Okay, let's get to it. In today's video, I'll start off by explaining the two basic types of steer tubes and why they matter when performing this maintenance. I'll then review all the tools you need for the job and then guide you through my 5 steps. My first is how to remove your fork from your bike. Step 2 is taking the proper measurements. Step 3 is placing the saw guide in place. Step 4 is making the cut. And the final step 5 is reinstalling your fork and the stem. Before going about cutting your steer tube to size, you need to know a bit about the two basic types you'll find on today's modern bicycle forks. You'll find heavier and more affordable forks constructed with aluminum alloy steer tubes, while premium forks will be built with carbon steer tubes that save some weight. Many forks like my Cannondale Lefty Ocho come in both an alloy version as well as a lightweight carbon model. So make sure to check out the specs on your model fork so that you know what material your steer tube is constructed of. The choice of material will affect how you go about tackling this task. My Cannondale Scalpel Lab 71 came equipped with a Lefty Ocho Carbon fork, so mine has a carbon steer tube. There are two notable differences in how you work with aluminum versus carbon steer tubes. First is the cutting blade. You'll be using a hacksaw to cut your steer tube to size, but the cutting blade differs between these two materials. For alloy steer tubes, any standard 12-inch hacksaw blade designed for cutting metals will do, something like a DeWalt 24 or 32 TPI bimetal blade. For carbon steer tubes, you must use a carbon-specific hacksaw blade like the 12-inch Park Tool CSB-1. The other notable difference between alloy and carbon steer tubes is the clamp that is used to adjust headset preload. Alloy steer tubes will use a top cap and star nut assembly, while carbon steers use a compression plug made specifically for carbon steers, like the Cannondale SL headset compression plug I have installed on my Lefty fork. So here are all the tools you need to disassemble your fork, cut your steer tube to size, and put it all back together again. You'll need a hacksaw fitted with the correct blade. In my case, that's a carbon-specific saw blade. You'll need a steer tube cutting guide, such as the oversized adjustable saw guide by Park Tool. To measure the location of your cut, you'll need either a tape measure or a digital caliper, plus masking tape or painter's tape, and a pen or pencil to mark the location of your cut. A fine metal file to smooth out the cut portion of your steer tube. And lastly, if cutting carbon, you should use a protective mask to make sure you do not inhale any of the airborne carbon filaments, which can be harmful to your health. You'll want to remove the fork from your bike to be able to cut the steer more easily. And for that, you'll need the proper size hex keys. For my Cannondale components, I'll need a 5mm hex to remove the top cap as well as the front wheel, a 4mm hex for the expander bolt as well as the 2 stem bolts, and a 2.5 hex for the brake cable guide guard. Lastly, to reassemble the fork and tighten the stem bolts and compression plug to the proper torque settings, you'll need a torque wrench with a long 4mm hex attachment. Step number 1 is to remove the fork from your bike to make it easier to cut the steer to size. Start by loosening the stop lock release lever on the Lefty 180 degrees downwards, which will then allow you to remove the brake mount from the fork. Now use your 5mm hex key to loosen the Lefty hub axle bolt on the drive side by turning it counterclockwise. Do this until the axle bolt is completely disengaged from the spindle. Then slide the wheel off the spindle end and put it aside. You then want to either loosen or fully remove the 2.5mm hex guide guard bolt. If loosening the bolt, you can probably rotate the guide enough to allow you to dislodge the brake hose from its support. I find it easier just to fully remove the 2-piece clamp assembly. You can then unclip the upper cable guide from the fork by pushing it upwards. Now the brake cable is separated from the fork, which will allow you to remove the fork from the frame of your bike. Time now to work at the stem end of the bike. Remove the top cap of the compression plug with your 5mm hex key. Once you get it going, you can finish it off with just your hands. Set it aside in a safe place. Now, using your 4mm hex, carefully and very slightly loosen the expander bolt. Don't loosen it too much or it'll fall to the bottom of your steer tube, and then you'll have to use this fishing tool contraption to pull it out. Pull out the compression plug and set it aside where it won't get misplaced. Now loosen the two stem bolts with your 4mm hex key. Make sure you hold your fork when fully loosening the stem bolts to prevent it from falling to the floor, or tie it to your frame with a bungee cord or some other strap. Fully remove the stem and the handlebars and tie it to your bike stand or the frame of your bike to support the weight as you work on the fork. Remove the spacers below the stem and set them aside. Remove the fork from the frame and remove the bottom headset bearing from the fork's steer tube. One of the most, if not the most important part of this task is to make sure you cut your steer tube to the right size. Once it's cut, there's no going back, so do not mess this up. Not only do you need to decide how much of the steer tube you want to cut off, you need to review and understand the installation instructions applicable to your specific headset preload assembly. For those of you with a Cannondale Carbon fork, your fork is likely to use one of these two proprietary Cannondale compression plugs. Road bikes like the System 6 or my Super 6 EVO will use a flat cap style compression plug which is designed to be a bit more aero. However, other bikes, especially mountain bikes like my Scalpel Lab 71, use a recessed cap design. These are often used with certain stem setups that require a single spacer above the stem. How the compression plug is fitted and installed differs based on the specific model of compression plug you're using. The point I want to drive home here is that installing it improperly can do major damage to your fork, your bearings, or your frame. Even between similar SL models like I have here, there's a difference in how these two types of plugs are installed. Cannondale states that for flat top plugs, the steer must be cut 3mm below the top of the stem. However, for the recessed cap style installed on my bike, the steer needs to be cut 3mm above the top of the stem. So you can see on my bike that the steer tube does indeed extend about 3mm above the top of the stem. Now that you understand how the whole steer tube assembly works, you can now confidently size and measure the amount you want to cut off. For me, I want to remove the height of two stem spacers. Since each spacer measures 5mm wide, I'll be dropping the rise in my handlebars by a total of 10mm. You determine for yourself how much you want to drop your stem. Now you'll want to wrap the steer tube with painter's tape or masking tape at the location where you'll be making the cut. The tape has a dual purpose. It will help prevent the carbon from fraying and also allow you to easily mark the location of the cut. So I'll measure out 10mm from the top of the steer where I want to make my cut. And I'll measure it again to make sure I didn't screw up. Remeasure, check, repeat that about 100 more times until you are more than 100% certain you are cutting off the correct amount of carbon. The Park tool saw guide I'm using has two slots. Yours may be different. The narrow slot is for bimetal saw blades used on alloy steer tubes, while the wider one fits carbon fiber specific saw blades. Since my steer tube is carbon fiber, I'll position the wider slot directly over my cut line and clamp the guide into place. No need to go crazy tight here, but secure it tight enough so that it won't slip when using the hacksaw. The clamp on this guide has soft rubber jaws to protect the surface of the steer tube. If yours has metal jaws, you'll need to wrap your steer with a rag or some soft cloth to protect the surface. Position the blade into the slot and make double sure the blade is sitting directly on the line you've marked. Now that you are satisfied your guide is in the right place, go ahead and cut away. You'll make a cleaner cut, especially when completing the last few strokes, if you don't use an excessive amount of pressure. Let the saw blade do all the work. No need at all to place much downward pressure on the saw. While the finished cut will be pretty smooth, you'll still want to use a fine file to round out the edges and remove any loose spurs. When you're happy with the finish, remove all the accumulated carbon sawdust. Remember that airborne carbon fibers are nasty, so keep your mask on throughout the entire process. With your steer tube cut to the proper length, you can now reinstall the fork into your frame, reversing the removal process I showed you earlier. When you get to reinstalling the stem, just tighten the stem bolts enough to prevent the fork from falling to the floor. You'll want both hands free when going about reinstalling the compression plug. When it comes to fitting the plug, the same rule applies as I mentioned earlier. Always refer to the manufacturer's instructions. In the case of my Cannondale compression plug, the placement of the plug within the steer is very important. The expander must be perfectly in line with the lower stem bolt. The reason for this is that the stem bolts work to counteract the force of the expansion plug pushing out from within the steer, as there's added strength in this area. I'll align the top of the plug with the top of the steer to make sure the expander is properly positioned directly behind the stem bolt. If necessary, I'll make adjustments to the depth of the plug until I have it perfectly aligned. While the official installation instructions don't call for it, I like to add a bit of carbon paste to the expander plug to give it more grip. Cannondale plugs are notoriously bad for slipping out of place over time. I'll use a 4mm hex key to finger tight the expander bolt. Then I'll finish it off by tightening it down with a torque wrench set to 4 Nm of force. I'll screw on the top cap lightly. The final process of applying the appropriate preload to the headset and aligning your handlebars is best done with the bike on the floor. I won't demo that process here, as I recently covered it off in detail in another video. Check it out if you're not familiar with that process. And that's it. Your steer tube is now cut to your desired length and properly installed on your bike. Here are the two side-by-side shots of my fork setup as it came originally out of the shop, and how it looks now with the removal of two 5mm spacers. If you have any questions about this video, drop them below. That's all I got for today, folks. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And if you're not a subscriber to this channel, please subscribe, as it allows me to produce more content for all of you. See you next time. Happy rolling.